What I want to look at now is regionality. This is a huge area in geography. And just as a note, I guess I didn't mention this before. It's important to remember that most geographers don't work in academia. Very few do. Geographers are, on one hand, it's a discipline that is hard to pin down, as you've already figured out. On the other hand, most folks that get degrees in geography are working either for the government or the private sector somewhere. If you're involved, for example, in GISs, like we saw at the start of the semester, if you're involved in developing GIS systems, very few folks that actually get the training in those systems. In fact, a fair number, for example, even at UH that have training in that area, many of them don't even finish their master's degrees because they get hired, they get recruited while they're still in the program once they've got the skill set to go work for Google or whoever. So there's a huge number of people that are geographers that have been trained in geography. Having said that, you're not going to find many of them in academia. One of the downsides of that is because most of them are in areas that you don't think of as being geography in the way that, for example, we're talking about in this class, is it's oftentimes hard for folks to realize how effective geography is as a skill set when you're looking for work. So geography programs in the United States, unlike Europe where they're popular, geography programs in the United States are shrinking. But the irony is the demand for geographers is growing, but there's a total disconnect between the public's view of geography, which is sort of memorizing places on a map, and the reality of what geographers do. And to be honest, geographers in academia have done a really crappy job of making it clear how useful degrees in geography are for career building. So having said that, regionality is one of the big areas. Enormous number of geographers working in especially in the private sector are what you might call either regional specialists, or they specialize in looking at the concept of region, and that's where they make their money. Walmart, Google, all your large corporations, especially retail corporations, have teams of geographers either on staff. Walmart has, I believe, almost 30 geographers working for them in 2 different units, but they also hire them under contract. So if you're Target, you might not have geographers at Target. I don't know if they do, but I can guarantee they hire geographers or companies that are built up geographers to do research for them and give them the answers that they need. So geography is a very effective discipline if you're looking for a career. Having said that, it's hard to get people to buy into that, and until you start asking around and realize the number of folks that, oh yeah, I got my degree in geography, which is actually a fairly common response in a lot of areas, especially working for the government. So regionality is a big part of this. When you think about it, it makes sense because if you're, for example, someplace like Walmart, you don't sell the same thing in every Walmart store, for example, even in the United States. Different areas of the United States have different things they want, different things they won't buy. So regionality is a hugely important part of retail. And geographers were and still are at the center of sort of defining that regionality in ways that then can, in a rather cynical way, make money off of. So what are regions? Okay, that goes back to our concept we mentioned earlier in the semester. Regions are an area of space that you're basically putting a boundary on some sort of an attribute that you want to measure. So a vernacular region is an area that has a particular, value or something about that cluster of places where people tend to do the same type of thing. And the reasons vary tremendously. In fact, let's stop this for a second. Let me show you one. Okay, here's an example of regionality, a vernacular region. This is a little town of Sunyi. It's in central Shanxi province. Our Chinese colleagues took us there when we were working with them in Xi'an. This is central China. Now, what's sort of interesting about this place is if you look at the roof, this is what the folks in the area call a carp scale roof. Carp, goldfish, whatever you want to call them, have large scales. And the way that people make roofs in this part of Shanxi province, in this part of central China, is with a particular pattern that you only find here. So according to the guys, I've never looked at the reports, but our colleagues were pointing out that basically for about 150 miles in any direction from here, you're going to find everyone makes the roofs the same way. They have the central roof tile pattern. They have the fish tail end to keep demons off. They have the corner trim, and then they have the actual tiles are unique. If you go about 150 miles to the west or to the east or south or wherever, they don't make the roofs the same way. Now, we actually asked one of the folks that had a house here, a lady here, and we asked her, why is the roof this way? And the answer was, well, that's how we make roofs. That's, what we think a roof should look like. Excuse me. And so this is what we call vernacular region. No one's made them do it this way. According to my colleagues, they have tiles back at least 1,000 years when they were made this way. So they've been doing this thing for a long time. And just as a note, this particular village is about 3,000 years old. Here you can see one of the old actual cut into the ground old style structures. And this particular house is, maybe only 10, 15 years old. But if you poke around the ground next year, you'll find that that particular family possibly has lived at this particular location, not in this house, but that location for maybe 800 to 900 to 1,000 years. And this place has been a village for basically almost forever. So on one hand, the buildings can be new, but that doesn't mean the people living there are new. And in part, that's probably why you find this particular type of roof. God knows why they originally did it, but now it's become a marker of home. If you're home, roofs look like this, and that's the type of roof you expect. If you don't see a roof like that, that means you're not home. So this is a vernacular region in the sense of vernacular just means common or normal or ordinary. So it's what regular people do. So no one ever set this up. It's not part of a building plan or anything like that. In fact, I'm not even sure if you could buy these tiles. I mean, they purchased them locally, but I don't think you could probably buy them outside of this area. They're probably just made by some guy in the town for the folks in the town. So this is very much a vernacular or local thing. So this is a region, and it's sort of a handy one because you can visually see this. If you look at the other roofs around here, they're all the same style of roof, different sizes, different shape, different slope, but they've all got the central ridge. They've all got the same way of doing a roof. The idea of a roof is basically there's one way to do it. What you're going to cover might vary, but the roof is the same. This is a classic example of vernacular region in the sense of something that's commonly held, commonly shared, and if you're trying to track down the why of it, you can end up. Okay. So, culture region. This goes back to the idea of cultures being shared or collective attitudes and values that are generated and part of a group identity. You can look at particular attitudes and values because in some areas, attitudes and values will spread out over a larger region or larger space. Others might be more shrunken or smaller. This was a hugely popular thing in geography right into the 1970s, 1980s. I don't see it as much now. I suspect it'll pop back up. You can actually do a culture trait analysis even in, for example, digital stuff. But it tends to be more traditionally, this would be things like architecture, types of food people consume, color of cars they drive, and the type of cars, automobiles they drive, is very much, sort of culturally driven and also regionality. So there's, also a huge part of what people have around them in terms of what they dress, the colors they use, all the type of stuff will be defined one by the group. And it'll usually have some sort of a bounded area where you don't see it happening outside of that, at least, say percentage wise. And so this again is the idea of culture region. So definition of culture first, and you're looking at some aspect of how that group manifests themselves. It could also be a belief, it doesn't have to actually be a physical thing. Regionality tends to fall into sort of three general categories, at least in terms we use in geography. One is the idea of formal. In a formal region, what you find is within that region, within that bounded area, there's almost everyone almost does the same thing. They almost all have the same attribute that you're looking at. And formal regions are actually not all that super common, especially nowadays. But if you have societies where people are much more stable and have moved around a lot, say Southeast Asia, or especially, for example, Europe and such, where you don't really have until recent large migrant populations, then you can find very formal regions. You can go through like Belgium and Germany, and you literally could drive through and see, one spot it looks like this, and another spot it looks totally different, or it's very, very different. But within that one area, every place looks the same. So this would be the idea of a formal region. In a minimal extent, you want to sort of expose yourself to this. Think of driving through a subdivision on Kapolei or Mililani or something like that. That's artificial in the sense that it was all built at one point in time. But the idea that you actually have all the houses look the same and they're all the same designs, and in many cases the same colors, same color palette, would be this idea of a formal region. A functional region is slightly different. This goes back to what we were talking about last time with the idea of functionality. So what you've got in a functional region is there's some sort of, again, something you're looking at that actually serves a purpose to the group of people. And within the area that they use that thing, that's going to be your functional region. Where they go into something else or use some other way of doing it, then that's sort of the boundary that ends that. Functional regions oftentimes will have some sort of a central locus where the functionality is most strongly expressed, or you see it most strongly, most persistently. And then it's going to sort of frequently sort of diffuse out. So the further you get away from the center, the less you'll see people doing things that way or using that particular thing that way. So functional regions tend to be, again, very much sort of object driven, because you're usually looking at something. A good example would be if you look at, for example, farm practices, or the type of equipment that people use in farming, or how they farm, or the type of seeds they plant. That tends to be very much functionally region driven, where you'll see one crop and all of a sudden you go somewhere else and you go to a certain distance away and pump, you don't see that anymore, you see something else. That would be a functional region. And again, for example, depending on what you're involved in, this is a hugely important area, for example, for marketing or retail, or for example, from the government standpoint, for education or say agricultural practices. So functional regions are fairly common in some aspects. Other particular traits and stuff, they don't tend to be very much so. Last of these is perceptual regions. These are regions that are defined by the perception of the group there. So that roof I showed you in Shanxi province in Sunyi, that would be a perceptual region. It's not only vernacular, but it's also perceptual. The people who live there see the idea of house or place you live should have a roof like that, and it should look like that. So that's their perception of home is tied to a particular roof design. Americans, I don't think necessarily have that. We have other perceptions that drive the idea of home, and they vary very much from place to place. In fact, yeah, let's take a look at that right now. Here's an example of perceptual region. Way back before you guys were born, when I was paying my way through undergraduate school, like you guys are in, I was basically first a department, then a store manager for Kmart, which was basically a precursor to Walmart in some ways. And I was one of the store managers in Oregon when we moved up there. So one of the things that struck me that I had not seen growing up in California was a tremendous fascination in Western Oregon for plastic gnomes. Now, you didn't see them everywhere. It's like everyone had them, but we carried them in the store. And I sure as hell didn't remember seeing anything like that in California where I grew up. So I was curious about that. And I was actually asking the guys that are the buyers, the ones that actually purchased these for the company, why? And they said, oh, well, you know what? You guys will sell a lot of these gnomes, but they only have particular types. Then one of the guys that bought these things actually pointed out that depending on where you were in the United States, you'd see different types of gnomes. So they were all plastic. You would stick them in the ground like you see, for example, in this one, you stick them on your yard or something like that. But the key thing they all had in common is they were gnomes. If you see, there's a tremendous diversity. I just clicked on Google on this, so you can see just this huge range of gnomes. In some cases, pretty surreal. In terms of how many people I got. I'm not sure exactly what they express. I never bothered trying to figure out what was behind gnomes. Depending on where you're from, you might have, been around a place like this. Your family might even have some, and depending on where you go visit on the mainland, you might even very well see a place where you see gnomes. I've never figured out why they're popular or what the variation is, but the guy was telling me very specifically, you see different types of gnomes in Oregon than you do that they sell in, for example, in Phoenix, Arizona, which apparently is a big place for gnomes. I have no idea why. And those are different than the gnomes you would see, for example, in Ohio. So, and I'm not sure, I'm someone, if you got a lot of free time, I have no doubt you could easily do a dissertation, maybe someone already has on plastic gnomes in the United States and their regionality. But this would be both vernacular, in a sense this isn't part of a social construct. People are putting these things up, based on their own choice. But what the guy was telling me, and it turned out this is certainly true when we were selling them, because I'd actually occasionally ask people when they were buying some of these things, because they're also buying plastic flamingos, but gnomes were the big thing, is why this, just out of curiosity. And they would say, oh, because my neighbor has one. Or, oh, because I've always wanted, or the house where we used to live, we used to have them, or something like that. So people's relationship with these plastic objects was tied to a bunch of different sort of complex patterns, but it had to do with perception, their perception of the gnome. And I never bothered asking this because I didn't have the time and I didn't want to waste their time. I'm not sure what the gnome means to them. I'm not sure what the gnome means to people, but it means something because they were spending money buying these things. And if something happened to them, they'd come back and get a replacement or something like that. And I do remember, at least in 2 cases, and I think it was East Portland, there was a spate of some kids for a little while stealing gnomes out of front yards, and it actually ended up in the news that people were upset because their gnomes had gotten stolen. So go figure. But gnomes are a good example of something that's got a very regional focus to it. And the folks that make these and the folks that buy and sell these can tell you that very explicitly. And it has to do with perception, though, again, I'm not sure why, especially, for example, this one. But it also has to do with sort of regionality in a very, very specific way. So it's sort of, a good way to sort of end this whole thing is with a bunch of plastic gnomes and trying to figure out what, why, and where about them. And this also gets back to this idea that we're talking about the importance of perception, people's perception of these objects and what they're trying to say, because they don't put them in their house. They put them out in the front yards. They're putting them so that other people will see them. So to a certain extent, they're making a statement of themselves to the outside by virtue of putting these gnomes up. And again, good luck, because you could spend a lot of time and effort and generate, I'm sure, at least 1 or 2 dissertations out of analyzing just exactly what the hell was going on with gnomes.